even more importantly than at other times. We have a great product before us. It makes huge changes, significant changes, and we need to send the signal that we can do this, get it then coordinated with the House version, which has already been passed, and move it to the President of the United States for his early signature. I genuinely thank my partner, Senator Jack Reed, for his tireless work with me to get to this point. I was looking forward to locking in a unanimous consent request at this moment, Mr. President, but I've been told to hold off. It could be coming in just a few minutes. But we have to get that unanimous consent to avoid vote after vote after vote on cloture on these various proposals and amendments. We've got to lock that in. We must do it this morning, in the next hour, perhaps between now and the first vote, which I believe begins in about 30 minutes. We simply cannot delay this process any longer. Let me make it clear. If we do not bring this to the floor today, this matter will not have time for deliberation on the Senate floor, and we'll have to basically pretend that we're having a conference between House and Senate members, and a very small group of senators will have to write this bill and bring it to the floor for final passage. That's not the way this ought to be done, and it can be avoided with a unanimous consent request in just a very few minutes. But the good news is we're ready to proceed. The good news is the committee is united, 26-1, and my ranking member and I are ready to proceed. We simply need a Democrat leader to come down here and agree to unanimous consent. And I yield the floor.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, before I begin my remarks, I would ask unanimous consent that privileges of the floor be granted to my congressional fellows and interns for the remainder of this Congress. They are Mary Horton, Kathleen Song, Valerie Hines, and Michael Noddy.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we've all talked about what the primary goal is right now in the Senate. It is to reopen the federal government, but that's not all we need to reopen right now. As we focus on ending this shutdown, I've come to speak in support of a disapproval resolution that is now pending. This is SHR 106. This is the companion to the resolution that Senator Sullivan and I have introduced to reopen the Central Yukon Resource Management Plan after the BLM finalized it over our objection last fall. So the formal name of this rule is the Central Yukon Record of Decision and Approved Resource Management Plan. The name is big, and it is a really big area encompassing nearly 56 million acres, mostly in northern and interior Alaska. So whole state of Alaska, but it is this central area here that is really quite substantial. And not all of that is federal land. You'll see the different colors here. In fact, most of it is not. This RMP is only supposed to affect 13.3 million acres managed by BLM. Now that is still a lot of land. To kind of put it into perspective, it's more than twice the total acreage of Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Hampshire, and Vermont. So that's what you're looking at here within this region. So we do need an RMP, a resource management plan, to guide management of the Central Yukon's federal acres. This plan is meant to replace older regimes that were put in place back in 1981, 1986, and 1991, as well as some lands that are unplanned. So this is a big undertaking. It's been going on for a long time, started back in 2013, 12 years ago, costing taxpayers millions of dollars to complete. I didn't want to have to overturn this RMP because I really do respect much of the work that was done, certainly the people who worked really hard to do it. And I also recognize that some Alaskans support pieces of last year's final plan and are concerned that their input could be lost if it is reopened. But the problem that we've got here, and why we're taking this resolution up today, is that the Biden administration, which was in office during the last few years of this 12-year process, really has left us with no choice here. They lost sight of the need for balanced management. They dropped any pretense of it from the final plan. So despite objections from me, from Senator Sullivan, the state of Alaska, many Alaska stakeholders, BLM kind of plowed ahead and they finalized a plan that overwhelmingly prioritizes conservation but fails to reflect the principle of multiple use that is required with our public lands and fails to honor the explicit requirements of federal law. There are some very significant issues within this plan. There are further deficiencies based on what BLM pledged to do and then refused to do. And that combination is what caused us to file this resolution and to seek a more balanced plan going forward. So, going through those problems in a little bit greater detail. I expect that one of the things that you're going to hear today in opposition is that this is unprecedented, that Congress is now overturning 12 years of non-political, legally sound agency work. And Mr. President, if that were true, I wouldn't be standing here in opposition to this. I would be a no on the resolution, but that's not where we are. In December of 2020, in BLM's 8th year of work on this RMP, the agency released a draft plan with a pretty reasonable preferred alternative. This is a proposal that would have protected sensitive areas. It would have upheld subsistence and recreational uses. It would have provided opportunities for resource development and other legal uses on BLM land. And under that proposal, many outdated public land orders, we call them PLOs, would have been lifted, and the majority of BLM's lands would have then be accessible. But just a few years later, we saw a very different preferred alternative emerge from BLM. This was in the middle of the Biden administration. The final record of decision issued last November is 362 pages long. There are multiple appendices that total another 1,428 pages. So It's 1,800 pages. I can't, this is the stack of the maps and the pages of the final record of decision. 1,800 pages showing these various designations and restrictions. This is in no way a user-friendly plan. It's not a printer-friendly plan, that's for sure. But it's also not a BLM employee-friendly plan. It's long, it's complex, and unless you're really super invested in learning what was designated as Visual Resources Management Class 2, as opposed to Class 3 or perhaps Class 4, you're probably not really going to enjoy reading it. The differences between what the BLM proposed in 2020 and what BLM finalized in 2024 show really how this process went off the rails. So giving you a couple examples here. In 2020, BLM proposed one area of critical environmental concern, we call them ACECs, and resource natural area. These are administrative withdrawals for conservation that restrict other uses. And this covered 77,000 acres. Then last year, BLM's final RMP balloons this to include 21 ACECs and RNAs covering 3.6 million acres. This is imposing restrictions on nearly 47 times more land. In 2020, BLM proposed 497,000 acres of special recreation management areas. In 2024, we saw that triple to 1.453 million acres. In 2020, BLM proposed little over 1 million acres of utility and transportation corridors. In 2024, that fell by 2/3 to just 33,000 acres. In 2020, BLM proposed to have almost 7.5 million acres open to fluid mineral leasing, and then in 2024, it leaves just 845,000 acres open. That's 89% less. So you can see the dramatic differences between the plan in 2020 and the plan in 2024. There's a lot more I could go through, but the point is restrictions exploded in the final plan, while opportunities for economic development were severely curtailed. And we saw it over and over in Alaska over the last 4 years. We don't think it was any accident. You've heard my colleague speak on the floor about this a great deal, but it was just really the last administration's goal to reduce and curtail many of these activities. BLM's treatment of public land orders, which have been obsolete in Alaska for decades, also backslid dramatically. And these came to be in the 1970s when Alaska's land ownership was greatly unsettled, but they should have been revoked a long time ago. In 2020, BLM proposed to revoke 5.863 million acres of so-called D1 withdrawals. But then in 2024, BLM zeroes that out. And instead, they've only lifted withdrawals for one narrow purpose. It's an important purpose, but it's very narrow, and that's allotments for eligible Alaska-Vietnam veterans, but no others. In 2020, BLM proposed to lift PLO 5150, reflecting state and native selections around our Trans-Alaska Pipeline Corridor. But then in 2024, BLM reverses course, refused to lift a single acre of PLO 5150 within the RMP process. And the problem is that BLM told us, they told me, they told my team, that they would address PLO 5150 through a separate process. They called it a tiered environmental assessment. And they said that that was going to begin immediately after the finalization of the Central Yukon RMP. But they just had to get to that point, and they just needed us to back off so they could. Guess what never happened? The day after the state of Alaska's consistency review period for the Central Yukon RMP ended, BLM canceled its separate process for PLO 5150. It was an absurd decision. BLM spent years telling us that they could only lift public land orders within the RMP process, and then as the Central Yukon RMP nears completion, they then tell us that they could only lift one of the most visible PLOs in Alaska outside of it. And then as soon as we reach that point, they break their promise, immediately pulling the whole thing down. My team was actually on the phone with BLM when this happened. They asked about the process, and they were told everything is on track, everything's going just fine. And right after, probably not even more than 30 minutes after that, BLM calls state officials to tell them it's off and never coming back. If that's not a bait and switch, I don't know what is. But this is where you can start to see how BLM's actions, both what it did and what it refused to do in this RMP, directly contradict multiple federal laws. The first is ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. That was Alaska's grand bargain. This is where Congress withdrew and conserved tens of millions of acres in our state in exchange for reasonable opportunities for economic development, whether it be within the 1002 area, the Ambler Road, but this was the deal back in 1980. And to confirm that Alaska had done its part for national conservation, ANILCA also includes several what we call no more clauses, reflecting the fact that we were done, no more wilderness needed to be designated in the state of Alaska. It should be pretty apparent that unilateral administrative designation of 3.6 million acres of ACECs, dozens of other restrictions across millions of other acres, and the retention of virtually all land withdrawals, which were supposed to be lifted decades ago, are all directly contrary to ANILCA. The Central Yukon Plan also conflicts with a law that I wrote called the Alaska Land Transfer Acceleration Act. Some people around here are still surprised that Alaska's land ownership is still not settled yet. 66 years after statehood, neither our state nor our native land entitlements have been fulfilled. We've got millions of acres remaining outstanding on both of these, and their settlement hinges on the federal government making available and then transferring selected lands. Congress agreed to enact my Alaska Land Transfer Acceleration Act back in 2004, and we set this goal that our land entitlements would be complete by 2009. That was the 50th anniversary of statehood. Well, that didn't happen, but some good did come from it. BLM surveyed its land withdrawals in Alaska, and then in 2006, there was a report to Congress that recommended that 95% of them, covering 152 million acres, could be lifted consistent with the protection of the public's interest. And the only caveat here was that BLM preferred to lift its orders through its land planning process. So we worked with them. We pushed to make that happen. We've appropriated funding to make it happen. But when BLM undertakes a new RMP and decides that not a single acre of a single PLO can be lifted across 13.3 million acres for any other purpose other than native allotments, you're going to see patience run out. And it turns to frustration, it turns to opposition, and it takes us to where we are today, which is congressional disapproval of a resource management plan. Now, I would also point out that the Central Yukon RMP conflicts with ANCSA, or the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. The regional ANC in the Central Yukon area, Doyon, has rightly pointed out that BLM's actions in this RMP would make it difficult, if not impossible, to utilize its lands for the benefit of its people in line with congressional intent. In a letter to Alaska's congressional delegation, Doyon explained how BLM's restrictive land designations will, quote, complicate access to and use of Doyon lands and potentially prevent Doyon from fully realizing the economic and other benefits that Congress intended it would enjoy as a result of ANCSA's settlement of Aboriginal claims. So, Mr. President, I'd ask that unanimous consent that the letter be included as part of the congressional record immediately following my remarks.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, we also received a letter of support for this resolution from the North Slope Trilateral, which includes the Inupiat community of the Arctic Slope, the North Slope Borough, and the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, ASRC. And their letter lays out in a series of fundamental flaws within the final Central Yukon Plan, including its failure to account for North Slope priorities, the impact that it would have on native lands, the barriers it creates to cooperative land management, the restrictions it imposes to foreclose the production of rare earth elements and other resources, as well as the lack of consultation with Alaska natives who live on the North Slope during its development. As the trilateral writes, quote, "The result is a plan that ignores congressional intent under both ANCSA and ANILCA, disregards the economic needs of North Slope communities, and creates unnecessary obstacles to infrastructure, energy, and community health across northern Alaska." So again, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the letter from the North Slope leaders be printed in the congressional record.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, the sad part is that what these Alaskans are pointing to, restrictions that encumber access to lands and opportunities, was largely the point of BLM's final RMP. And that, again, points to why we're here to disapprove this plan. Now, I should point out that there's a big misunderstanding about the effects of this resolution. There's been some false claims out there. I think there's been some kind of sloppy reporting of them. But when the House passed this resolution, we saw over and over again in different articles that somehow or other that passage of that resolution had approved the Ambler Access Project, which is not the case. That project has been in permitting for a decade, and then just on Monday, President Trump issued a determination reapproving it, which we appreciate, but nothing in this disapproval resolution approves that project. So that's just misinformation out there. But what is true is that over the course of decades, Congress has ceded a lot of authority on federal land management to the executive branch. We trust them to follow the laws that we've made, find a balance between competing uses and priorities. And we know it's not an easy job, especially in a state where you have more than 223 million federal acres. But when the agencies lose sight of that, it's our job here, it's our responsibility to rein them in, and that's what we're doing. We're reminding BLM that these are public lands that are generally available for multiple use, not exclusively conserved lands with layer after layer of administrative restrictions heaped onto them. Before I end here, I'd like to briefly discuss what comes next if we're able to pass this disapproval resolution. It should be very clear. Passage does not invalidate 12 years of agency work. It does not overturn the environmental analysis that's been done or the public comments that have been received. We are simply reopening this plan, and we're telling BLM, return, come back with a new one that is more balanced. And that shouldn't be hard, and it shouldn't take that long because the plan already exists. It was just abandoned once the Biden administration took office. For 8 years, BLM was on the right track in this process. It has a ready-made plan in the form of its preferred alternative from 2020. The record of decision from last year even acknowledges that the 2020 preferred alternative features a, quote, blend of resource protection and resource development. It's an actual balance between the two, and that's what we should be seeking. It's time to go back to that proposal, update it as needed based on the passage of time, and put into place a final Central Yukon plan that maintains access, respects multiple use, and conserves where necessary and appropriate. And it's entirely possible to serve the varied interests of this region. And through this resolution, that's exactly what we're telling BLM to do. And when they do, we'll have a final Central Yukon resource management plan that Alaska's delegation, the state of Alaska, the largest landowner in the region, Doyon, and a wide range of Alaskan stakeholders can support. So I would urge my colleagues to support this resolution. I yield the floor to my colleague from Alaska who has worked very, very hard on this resolution, and appreciate his leadership of the same.
Mr. President.
The other senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 15 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without
I ask
objection.
unanimous consent to waive the mandatory quorum calls with respect to cloture on the motions to proceed to calendar 167, Senate 2882, and calendar 168, HR 5371.
Without objection. Senator from Alaska.
I want to thank my colleague, Senator Murkowski, on her remarks on the vote that we're getting ready to take on the CRA, dealing with the Central Yukon Plan. And I'm going to be a little bit briefer since she covered a lot of material and did a great job doing it. But I want to give my colleagues just a little sense of, these are the elements of why this plan, quote, plan, needs to be repealed by the U.S. Senate in part of a CRA. By the way, Mr. President, this is going to continue in the vein of what we did with your great state, Montana, and North Dakota, the last 2 days on the Senate floor with these CRAs. And what's going on here? Well, we all know what's going on here, both with regard to Montana and with regard to North Dakota, and of course with regard to Alaska. The previous administration came in and said, even though it's probably illegal, we're going to try and lock up these states because we don't want resource development on these states. Now imagine, Mr. President, Senator Murkowski mentioned the Central Yukon Plan that the Biden administration issued. We didn't want it. Nobody really wanted it in Alaska. It's almost 56 million acres, okay? That's the size of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania combined. Just that one plan. Gives you a sense of how big my state is. But can you imagine a president of the United States, if you were a Republican, telling the people of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania that they're going to be saddled with a plan they didn't want to large swaths of their land, destroying thousands of jobs, which is what this plan would do? Nobody would accept that. This plan, scheme of the Biden administration disregards local voices, ignores protections guaranteed under federal law, ANCSA and ANILCA, and undermines the ability of Alaska Native corporations who did not want it to access and responsibly develop their lands, which Congress gave them in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971. So these are the key elements of why it's a problem, Mr. President, and it's also part of a long pattern with the Biden administration that I never tire of reminding people. This is the chart we call the last frontier lockup. The last administration issued 70 executive orders and executive actions singularly focused on Alaska. 7-0. I confronted President Biden in the Oval Office respectfully when we were at 48. Here's the list of them, by the way, Mr. President, of the 70. That's each one. 7-0. Only against Alaska. And I said, Mr. President, why are you doing this? Why are you going to war with my people? Working families, Americans. You're sanctioning Alaska more than you sanction Iran and Venezuela, and they're terrorist regimes. You know, he didn't know. I don't think he knew what was going on, but it was wrong. In this, by the way, Mr. President, this Central Yukon Management Plan was one of the 70 that we didn't want, that the vast majority of the Native people didn't want. Certainly that the Native Corporation Doyon, most of their land, they didn't want it. So, Mr. President, what we need to do instead, as opposed to locking up Alaska, as I said to President Biden, it's not good for Alaska, sir, but it's also not good for America, is we need to do this. Unleash Alaska's extraordinary resource potential. And by the way, thank you, President Trump. This is a day one executive order, one of the first executive order President Trump issued when he came into office in January and said, we're not going to lock up Alaska, we're going to unleash it. So, in his executive order, we also have essentially getting rid of this Central Yukon Management Plan from the Biden administration. So thank you, Mr. President. Now my colleagues, I'm asking all of them, and I'm particularly asking my Democratic colleagues, because I want you guys to show that you're not so anti-Alaska. The Democratic Party at the national level has become the anti-Alaska party, an anti-Alaska Native party. So many things that we care about in my state, in the interest of the Native people, all my colleagues on the other side of the aisle make it a point to try to crush us in our opportunity and cancel Native voices. Yes, Indigenous voices. You're always working to cancel them. Here's your opportunity, Democrat colleagues, to vote yes on this CRA. Listen to me and Senator Murkowski, the people who represent the people in the great state of Alaska. Listen to President Trump. So that's what we want, and I'm going to just mention one final thing, Mr. President, why this is so important, why I get really animated about this with all my colleagues. A lot of people have seen this chart, but I like showing it because it's a really important issue. This is a chart from the American Medical Association from 1980 to 2014, and it had life expectancy in America, okay? So the places that are blue, darker blue, purple, if you look at the chart, these people are living longer. Purple is 13 years. So in 24 years, certain parts of America, the life expectancy of Americans increased by 13 years. Now, unfortunately, in our great nation, look at the yellow, orange, and red on this chart, that's actually life expectancy decreases. We, of course, nobody wants that. A lot of that was the opioid epidemic and things. But guess which state had the greatest increase in life expectancy of any place in America from 1980 to 2014? According to the American Medical Association, Alaska, especially the North Slope region, interior Alaska, Aleutian Island area, southeast Alaska. So what happened 1980 to 2014 in that part of Alaska? I'll tell you what happened. Responsible resource development happened. And people started living longer. They got jobs. They got water and sewer, flush toilets, gymnasiums, health clinics, things that the lower 48 just takes for granted that we didn't have in a lot of our state because we had responsible resource development, mining, oil and gas on the North Slope, fishing out on the Aleutian Island chains, all because of laws that we made here in the Congress. The people of Alaska, particularly the Native people, started living longer. Living longer. I've asked my colleagues, I've used this chart a lot, give me an indicator of policy success more important than the people you represent are living longer. There isn't one. That's the most important. The people you represent are living longer. Why? Because of responsible resource development. There's no doubt. Here's the chart. Alaskans are living up to 13 years longer. Now, Native people in my state unfortunately started at a real low level, some of the lowest levels of life expectancy, but because we're developing our resources responsibly, my constituents are living longer. So when you have these groups, and you have the Biden administration, and no offense, you have a lot of my Senate Democrat colleagues, try to shut down my state, which they always do, you know what you're doing? You're actually impacting people's lives and how long they live. So, Mr. President, this is really important for me and the people I represent. This is a good opportunity to tell the Biden administration, hey, you're not going to do this. You're not going to do it to Montana. You're not going to do it to North Dakota. And you're certainly not going to do it to Alaska because you're going to negatively impact people's lives. So I really hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and I really hope at least one or two Democrats have the courage to come and say, you know what, Dan, you've been talking about this for 10 years. I agree with you. I'm going to vote to rescind this Biden CRA or this Biden Yukon management plan that nobody wanted to help your state and help America. One more thing, Mr. President. In this part of the state where that Central Yukon management plan is, like I said, 56 million acres, 51 of the 56 critical minerals that our country needs are in this area. You know, I was in an armed services hearing recently, and everybody, including a lot of my Democrat colleagues, like, gosh, we're so reliant on China for critical minerals. What can we do? I can tell you what you can do. Quit shutting down my state. Let us develop critical minerals in Alaska as opposed to relying on them from China. So that's another reason this is important for national security of our country. And with that, I ask all my colleagues to support this CRA, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator of Mississippi.
I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Democratic leader, and notwithstanding Rule 22, it be in order to call up the following amendments to Calendar 115 S 2296. Paul, number 3761. Cruz, number 3274. Scott of Florida, number 3535. Marshall, number 3213. Moran, number 3814. Curtis, number 3697. Lee Duckworth, number 3288. Cotton Gillibrand, number 3759. Cornyn Cortez Masto, number 3926. Haggerty Peters, number 3841. Schumer, number 3109. Van Hollen, number 3872. Duckworth, number 3210. Warnock, number 3010. Kane, number 3337. Sanders, number 3853. Merkley, number 3927. Further, that with respect to the amendments listed above, at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Democratic leader, the Senate vote on the amendments in the order listed, with no further amendments or motions in order, and with 60 affirmative votes required for adoption, and that there be 2 minutes equally divided prior to each vote. Further, that upon disposition of the Merkley Amendment 3927, the following amendments be called up and made pending en bloc, and that they be the only remaining amendments in order to S 2296. Scott of South Carolina, 3340. Hassan, 2928. Grassley, 3355. Warnock, 2952. McCormick, 3376. Ossoff, 2971. Cornyn, 3405. Kane, 3039. Capito, 3435. Gallego, 3136. Langford, 3439. Duckworth, 3156. Blackburn, 3489. Shaheen, 3351. Kennedy, 3703. Booker, 3530. Daines, 3732. Slotkin, 3557. Ricketts, 3788. Peters, 3570. Hawley, 3799. Hickenlooper, 3601. Rounds, 3810. Coons, 3712. Tillis, 3811. Cortez Masto, 3724. Moran, 3813. Klobuchar, 3751. Grassley, 3823. Klobuchar, 3818. Kennedy, 3702. Durbin, 3825, Fisher 3842, Padilla 3834, Cruz 3890, Hirono 2979, Grassley Durbin 3272, Cruz Cantwell 3742, Scott of South Carolina Warren 3901, Rish Shaheen 3819, Graham 3899, Sullivan Whitehouse 3888, Collins 3880, Hirono 3015, Peters 3753, Shaheen Rish 3826, Coons 3728, Gallego 3928. That the Senate vote on the amendments en bloc, that upon disposition of the amendments, the pending Thune amendments and motions be withdrawn. The Ernst Amendment 3427 be agreed to. The Wicker-Reed Substitute Amendment 3748 as modified and as amended be agreed to. The bill as amended be considered read a third time, and that the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended with 60 affirmative votes required for passage, and if passed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President,
Senator from Mississippi.
on behalf of the leader, I ask unanimous consent that it be in order for the two leaders to enter motions to reconsider without being on the prevailing side with respect to the cloture votes on the motion to proceed to S 2882 and HR 5371.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to counter number 167 S2882, a bill making continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2026, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debated on the motion to proceed to S2882, a bill making continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2026, and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts,